dear friends. Welcome to another episode of the 10 Laws podcast with East Forest. I'm East Forest, and today I have a return guest, Mr. Cody Wiggs. Cody's someone who was back on an earlier episode, and we had reconnected because Rod and I were out there in Denver, which is where he's located, and it sort of just popped into my head that he had offered to help facilitate an experience. He does a lot of work with ketamine therapy, and well, you know me, I'm interested in this stuff, and so I reached out, and he was kind enough to slot us in, and it was really an amazing experience. And so we get into the details of what that experience was like, but it's something that really got me interested more in this particular compound as a medicine and how it can be used therapeutically, and particularly how it was interacting with, we used the Spores album, which is a future East Forest record that is excerpts from the Music for Mushrooms, a soundtrack for the Psychedelic Practitioner album. So it's basically a shorter version of the Music for Mushrooms album, and it worked just wonderfully with that. And I'm always, of course, pretty excited to interface with my music in that space, because that's how all this started for me 10, 11 years ago when I first made the Education for the Individual Soul, my very first record, and I was dropping into that space to use it as a tool with psilocybin. That honestly what kickstarted this entire thing. So at the end of the day, that's sort of like the core base use for me, is using this music for a tool. And this was just a new tool, so I was just really excited to have that. We'll get into that. Back here on my end, I'm getting ready to go to the Science and Non-Duality Conference this weekend. If you're listening to this in a timely fashion, going to be pretty psyched. I'm doing a East Forest ceremony concert on Friday night there at the conference in San Jose. So if you're there, please say hi. And if you're thinking of coming, they might have some tickets. It's a pretty large-scale event. And after that, we're really working hard to get our visa stuff together for China, because we're supposed to take off for that on November 12th, I believe, and we're still getting some. Who knew that it was kind of challenging and complicated to get a visa to China, but we're making it happen. So I got some stuff to do on that today. And otherwise, I might have mentioned on earlier podcasts that I've been working on a music studio space here in Boise at Rada's home. She had an exterior garage that I've been converting into a mixing space and a music space. And so basically some soundproofing and insulation, electrical, all that kind of stuff, building windows. And we ran into some issues with the city of Boise. Like a neighbor complained, so they shut us down. They came over, we got a stop work order. So for months now, it's been just in stasis as we've been working backwards with the city to try to come into compliance. And the huge great news is that the inspector, Tony, came over on Monday, and he was cool. I mean, it was like the best case situation. And so essentially we got the green light. I'm moving ahead. Everything's cool. And I'm kind of in denial that this is actually now going to get finished. So I've been out there working, and it feels good, man. It feels good to get my hands dirty and get back in the game of cutting wood and measuring stuff. And it's always been an aspect that I find really balancing, and something that I typically really look forward to when I wake up. I'm like, oh, I got to go out there and build. And it often feels like the perfect yin to the yang, or is it the yang to the yin? I don't know, to music making, which feels very right brain. And going out there and building is obviously very left brain, but it does involve right brain activities too, of creativity and problem solving. So maybe, in some ways it's a form of creativity, construction and carpentry. And it's so rich, and because you're using your body as well, it's a sort of like body-mind, full-body experience of working. So it has similarities to music in that sense, and I've been out there, and I'd love to get it done by Thanksgiving, but there's a lot of, China and touring and things going on. We'll see, but I'll keep cracking away. And I need to do that because while I'm up here this winter, based out of Boise, I need to make music. I need to keep doing what I do, mostly so I can stay happy, but also just to make a living and start working on the next stuff, the next projects. So, hey, did you enjoy the Christopher Willits remix or rework that came out? And we've got the next one coming out, which is Laraji, as I might have mentioned last week. If you don't know Laraji, he's an ambient legend. I think the story goes that he was discovered in Washington Square Park in New York City by Brian Eno quite a while ago, and that brought him into prominence. And since then, he's just a super wild dude. I'm going to try and get him on the podcast if I can, but he's a tough one to nail down. But we did talk a little bit, and I helped him out with this rework. I mixed it for him, and we got it mastered, and it is in the queue. So November 1st, All Saints Day, it's perfect because he did a rework of the track, like taking off an old shoe, a.k.a. Death, the Laraji rework. So I think you're really going to enjoy that. And then we have several more in the queue, several amazing artists out there right now working on reworks that I'll tell you about as they start to unfold. And that'll go pretty much till the end of the year to culminate and wrap up the Ram Dass project with these other additional voices. All right, so let's get into this conversation with Cody Wiggs. We take things even deeper and just sort of catch up on what our thoughts have been on this process, and I'll tell you all about my experience in the ketamine world. Here it is, Cody Wiggs. Well, Cody, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me back. Excited to reconnect with you.
Yeah, you reached out. I mean, we ran into each other recently because you reached out in Denver. But before that, you were kind of saying that since we last talked, like your work has evolved and there's more things to share. And then we bumped into each other when I was in Denver with Rada for the Jonesy and Alex concert. And you were kind enough to link up the next day, which was just perfect, man. And
awesome.
I got to have a wonderful experience with you, at least you doing the guiding for ketamine, and it was really positive and powerful for me. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I'm excited to hear how that's been unfolding for you and drop in a little further on what your experience of the ketamine space was. It's a space I've had a lot of difficulty lately actually articulating because it does move so far beyond language, I find often. And so I'm always keen to hear what other people are finding in that space.
Yeah, well, you're right. It is hard to describe. But I was talking about this with Rada yesterday, and we were doing just that, like trying to describe it. And what I was surprised by is how it sort of took me to this non-dualistic, what we like to call the cosmic center type place, which is a very hyper spiritualized place for myself. I would imagine for anybody.
Right.
That was surprising to me. I've read about ketamine, and you and I spoke about together last time, just about like its effects with depression and sort of like that clinical standpoint, which I knew about, but I wasn't sure like if that was purely a chemical reaction, and maybe that may be a large part of it. But I was, through my own experience, I realized like, oh, there's a deep spiritual part of this that probably has a lot to do with, the alleviation of that depression, which is awesome because really that's in a lot of ways the root of a lot of depression, sort of like a depressed spirit.
Yeah, or a sense of separation and longing and not having a sense of home, really. Right.
So I remember there was a moment in it where I always had a sense of me. And there were times where it was sort of, I was totally open to wherever it wanted to go. And I was totally willing to like try to allow it to go as deep as it could and to really like let go into whatever space was unfolding. And so there were absolute moments where I felt like I was transcending a sense of self But I remember having a thought as like, is this one of the best like psychedelic experiences I've had? I was like, that's so crazy. I did not wake up today thinking it would be like this. I thought it would
Yeah.
just be nice and it would feel good afterwards, and we'd work through some ritual and ceremony together. But there were moments where, I mean, I can remember them now, like sort of the lessons I was learning and the feeling I was feeling and sort of the visual landscape I was in and how that was interacting with the music in particular.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have two kind of questions coming up for me. The first would be, the music being obviously part of this, but I'm curious how you felt, and this is kind of selfish, really, just so I can further my own understanding of my work. What was the interaction between the space itself and experience? And so, all elements of the space, including obviously me being in the room, Rada being in the room, the symbols, the ritual, the sound, and how that, might have been different from, let's say, like if you took this on your own, without that relationship piece.
Well, I remember thinking in it, and I think I mentioned this a little bit to you afterwards, that like the set and the setting, the set we're in and the mindset we're in is very important, as this has been known for a long time. But I was really recognizing that the person, in this case you, who is holding that space, guiding that space, leading that space, and setting the tone is maybe the top of the pyramid of what's important. Because the rest of the stuff, like the medicine itself or the intention you have or even the mindset you're in, can't really work if you're inside a container that isn't jiving for you. Or in some ways, it's going to steer it in a direction.
Right.
And so you kind of steered it in. It was grounded. It was very relaxed, and your demeanor is very grounded and calm. And then we worked through a bit of like a medicine wheel and talked about intentions. And so all this stuff creates that ritual and container and stuff that, I talk about a lot, about how this sort of primes the brain and the heart. And that, I think, did help the experience. And in addition to the fact that, the music was a pretty good sound quality, and I'm biased. We were listening to East Forest, and I was really comfortable, and I was really remarking to myself, like, which that actually allowed me, as I was lying down on the couch, to really fully lose myself in my body. And I had moments where I was able to release to a degree where I wasn't quite sure where my body was in space, which is wonderful, right?
Yeah.
Like if I was in a space where it's cold or I couldn't get comfortable, I wouldn't even be able to get past that threshold. Mm-hmm. So doing that and then knowing that you were there, so I didn't really have to worry about time or the music or anything. I'm like, well, if he feels like something needs to be spoken to, he will. And if he's not, then I know things are good. And that allows me to just relax even more, having like that sitter role and someone who's experienced with it to know, what to say when it's over, how to come in and out of this. Because I didn't know. Mm-hmm. I'm just in it. And I'm like, I don't know. This maybe is a peak. I don't know. And I could just ride it though and just roll with it. So it felt good. Really good.
Yeah. And what's been interesting to me about, both your experience and a lot of what I've been seeing in session lately is there is quite a bit of space in session where at least verbally we're not interacting, right? Like you're pretty much in your experience and I'm literally just sitting. And as a therapist, people are coming to me and paying me money to help them. It's something honestly I've struggled with sometimes of like, well, what is the significance or the importance of actually just sitting and just holding space, whatever that means. But in my own journeys recently, in the last couple of months, I've definitely, even been in a situation where all these people were having these big experiences and it would be easy to get caught up in, sort of a spiritual materialism comparison game of like, well, what's my experience going to be like? And when the time came for me, nothing really happened at all. Even though I'd taken a pretty powerful medicine and yet there was so much beauty in that experience because I was surrounded by 6 people, all just silently sitting and being witness to my process and my experience and really attuned in a way that was actually quite present, even though there wasn't an exchange of words. So that it's just a dynamic I've been really curious about of what we can offer one another just through presence.
Well,
The
I
value
think the
that is.
role of the sitter is not something that's really valued or taken into consideration for as powerful as for what it is. And I think that's what we were talking about before about, what was my experience with you? And I'm just using that word sitter, guide, facilitator, whatever you want. It's really, really powerful. And I've said over and over again that, your attention is your currency, and like that's a huge gift you give, and it's also something that's commodified in this world. But they know that because it truly is like one of the most powerful gifts you have. And so just sitting there and being present, it's like that is the ultimate, really. And there's the old Terrence McKenna line about, he's like, all you need is like a person in the next room, and maybe and they just pop their head in every now and then, and they're like, "You cool?
You doing all right?"
Or like I ring a little bell if I need them. But basically, I've always told people, it's like, do the least amount you need to do.
Yep, non-invasive.
But yeah, that decision about whether or not to act is very powerful. It's not a simple because it's so easy to do too much. And it's so easy to steer someone with your own bullshit that you're bringing into the picture. It's so easy to kind of color in a not very powerful way, and to try to get the person through something that maybe is uncomfortable for you to witness, that now you're actually not allowing them. You're stunting their own growth through the process.
Right. And, the sort of flip side of that is that there are moments of intervening, certainly, and a lot of my sessions are highly interactive, kind of the opposite of the experience you had, where we're engaging and talking the whole time. And, maybe this has come up for you, but what I've been playing with is speaking more from my body directly, and from my experience of, people use the language like somatic hit. So that I'm almost in a bit of a meditative state as I'm there holding space. And that, in my mind, or the mind, or just has all these ideas, right? And is constantly wanting to check in or make sure, there's quite a bit of checking myself of now's not the time. But every now and then something will come up in my body that's like a distinct sensation. And often that will then just be coming out as words. And it's just the words that maybe need to be spoken in that moment, or that take the process a little bit deeper. And, we could speculate all day on what that actually is. I think there is some kind of co-resonance in the space of being with another person's body in the same room. And as you said, giving that currency of attention, where sometimes the stuff that comes through and comes out of that process is surprising to both people.
Sure, I would imagine. I mean, how do you find that you're able to trust your own intuitive sense or experience to know, if it goes from not saying anything to helping them somatically with pressure on their body, or this is going to be we're going to talk through something?
Yeah, I just actually was talking with somebody else this morning who does this work, and we both kind of agreed that luckily for us as facilitators, there's a lot of forgiveness in the medicine space. So whether we're talking about MDMA or ketamine, I've had plenty of times as a facilitator where I'll voice something I think is what needs to be spoken. And, the person having the experience is like, yeah, no, no, that's not accurate at all. And they just continue with their experience. And it's my willingness more than anything else to let go of my attachment to, being at the center of the process, or being right, or saying the right thing, and get it wrong sometimes. But then more and more through that trial and error process, I think that's where I'm finding the trust in my own intuition, is that, when I do take the risk and say something, and it does deepen their experience, and it does hit for them and lands and takes them further, it's just a learning experience over time of having done a lot of these sessions, where I find, again, coming back to the body, which sensations are true and which ones are more my mind just creating stories.
Do you think that if all drugs were legal, would ketamine still be the one that you would work with in this fashion? Do you think it would still be the most powerful for sort of not too long, not too short, for psycho-spiritual and emotional well-being?
It's certainly one that would be at the top of my toolbox. And I think I would have kind of a tiered approach and access to multiple medicines if everything were on the table and legal. But ketamine is really distinct and unique as for the qualities you just mentioned, that, you can be really in and out in less than 2 hours. It's generally incredibly safe and warm and comfortable. And it lends well to the therapeutic space for that reason, that you can have a process very quickly, enter the space, come back down, and then have some integration support and, do a few sessions in the series of 2 to 4 weeks, which is a pretty deep dive and not nearly as hard on the body as like a 6 or 7 hour, like MDMA session,
Right.
psilocybin session.
Well, I find that with MDMA, a lot of people report that there's a sense of depletion.
Mm-hmm.
Although they might have had, some healing, there's also this mental and physical depletion afterwards. And that's sort of the common blues that can happen afterwards. Some folks can be quite profound, and that they actually avoid the highs because of the lows. And that was something I really wanted to watch in myself after this, the ketamine experience. I just wanted to see how I felt. I have not felt like elated, but I haven't felt down. I mean, I just kind of feel like good. But I did feel good walking in, but I did not feel depleted at all.
Right.
I didn't feel physically depleted. I didn't feel emotionally depleted. If anything, I felt emotionally inspired because I was able to tap into a space that feels like a source. And you're like, oh, right. There's a remembering to that. And that's comforting. I think that's probably the same thing that they're seeing in the results with like psilocybin and end-of-life care. This probably has something to do with like connection to all that is, so you're a little less afraid of losing what you have in your body in life.
Yeah. And who really knows, right? It is kind of mind-blowing to me that this experience that's so out of body and so far removed from, sense of self and identity and ego and everyday reality actually kind of brings you deeper into reality when you come back.
Right.
What I hear you saying is kind of commonly reported that, we're not really aiming for elation. It's not as if you're going to walk out and be like, everything's amazing, but that there's kind of a deeper relaxation into just what is, and be a willingness to just ride the waves of life.
Why do you think this is more of vogue lately? It's been around. And how come it didn't capture the psychedelic parlance in the past as something of use? Like the medicine itself hasn't changed, and the container we're putting it in, I suppose, is more intentional, but it's not like it's radical.
It's a good question. My only response really is stigma that I find even amongst the psychedelic crowd or plant medicine crowd or whoever, that the ketamine, people hear the word ketamine and often the visceral response is like, oh, I did that at a party and I'll never do it again. Or isn't that like a horse tranquilizer? Or there's just kind of like quite a bit of misunderstanding of what ketamine actually is and how it can be used in a therapeutic space. I think people just see it as a club drug, which is kind of the same stigma that MDMA carried, but for whatever reason, and also because ketamine is really not a classic psychedelic.
No, but that's what screwed with me in my head, because I knew that going in, but then I was having these experiences that were not visually psychedelic, but emotionally they absolutely were, by my definition. And that's what surprised me, because I had some of those predilections about ketamine in the past. I kind of thought like, I've read about this and that, but I've always just heard about K-holes, and I thought about it in the same league as cocaine or anything else. It's sort of a thing people did at parties. And then I heard the research, and I still thought, well, it's not like this plant that grows out of the ground. It's not a fungus. It just pops up from the earth. It's this drug that we've created. So most of those sorts of drugs, whether it's MDMA or others, they don't do so well in your body.
No.
And so that's why I'm still skeptical, even though I experience this, because like it sounds a little too good to be true.
Yeah, and it kind of feels that way in terms of my work. Is the transformations I'm seeing in clients, and I don't feel like I'm exaggerating this in any way, are nothing short of remarkable. That people who are coming in with lifelong depression and over the series of, let's say 4 sessions, in 2 months or less, are walking out like, yeah, I'm better. I'm different and I'm changed and I'm not going back to that old place of depression. And honestly, I can't even really take credit for that because I don't fully understand what's happening in the ketamine space. But I'm certainly just grateful that this exists, and that it, from everything I can tell, all the research, all the experience I've had now, it has very little load on the body, very little negative impact, and if anything, you leave feeling better, and more relaxed and more safe and more spacious. So. And even further, it increases neuroplasticity in the brain, so you can actually learn more effectively post ketamine, which is very different than MDMA or even, any of the other psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin.
Well, what is the frequency though where things could get ugly? I mean, there has to be, because I also, when it came on at first, I was thinking, oh, there's a familiarity to this. And when I've had anesthesia, like when you go to the hospital and talk about the good stuff, it's like that wave of a body buzz and everything feeling okay and your anxiety goes away. There was definitely a bit of that. There was that color. And I thought, oh, okay, it's that kind of world, which is quite pleasing. And I could see how some people could abuse that. I don't know what the addictive qualities are of ketamine, nor do I know even the real toxicity of it. We talked about this a little bit anecdotally, but these are interesting things to know. I
mean, the safety profile is incredibly high in terms of not affecting the body in any sort of deleterious ways at the doses we're using in therapeutic sessions, right? But that there are certainly, and even the addiction profile, is very low. That biochemically, it's not a highly addictive substance. There's a kind of the classic case study in the field is John Lilly. I don't know if you've heard of him, the guy who was...
Yeah, the float tank guy.
Yeah, and,
did he talk to dolphins or...
Something. He talked to all kinds of...
Yeah, he's got a whole book about dolphin communication.
Yep. But he got deeply addicted to ketamine, to the point where the stories go that, he'd like go to a party and he was just out in his van shooting up ketamine and just really getting lost in that space. I think he drowned in his hot tub once and his wife revived him. So, talk about abuse, and I think eventually it probably did lead to his death. But from what I've read and understand, that was more for him about a rejection of this level of reality, of existing in this plane, and in favor of whatever the ketamine dimension was or is, right?
Yeah.
He was more attuned to and addicted to just escaping into that realm, and that it was less about ketamine as a substance being physically addictive.
Yeah, it's like pot being emotionally addictive psychologically, and there's lots of things like that for sure. I mean, look, I meet people who are, there's definitely a form of addiction happening just with medicine work, with whether it's ayahuasca or, even though you're like, how could someone be addicted to something so challenging? It's like, boy, do I see it. They just can't stop diving into that space over and over and over again, and deeper and deeper and deeper.
Well, and that brings up a sort of a broader question for me, which is a theme I've been working with, as you said at the beginning, that since April, I've been on this arc of personal growth that's been honestly destabilizing in a lot of ways, in the sense that it's just taken me so deeply into the intensity of my experience, my embodied experience, my uncomfortable emotions, my physical pain, my emotional pain, in ways that, somehow feel like they're good for me. If that makes sense, this is actually a new kind of peak of growth for me, in that I feel like I'm coming to a space in my own work where I'm really focused on being here in a very simple, grounded way, that I'm not seeking to escape my experience. And so the kind of question that comes up for me is well, what are we really doing on this path? Whether it's the medicine path or the meditation path or the the spiritual healing or whatever you want to think about, like what's the end game here? And I don't expect you to have an answer necessarily, but curious what your experience has been.
Well, I think the end game is that the realization that there's no end game.
Mm-hmm.
That is the mystery in itself. Yeah, it's an infinite unfolding process. When we get into the notion of a destination, that's why I think the term enlightenment is somewhat damaging, because it is just a word that's trying to represent something, it's a symbol. And what it's representing is like God. It's ineffable.
Right. And it's
problematic.
It's problematic. And I had an experience recently. I was in a 5-day somatic meditation retreat. And at some point in that retreat, it just hit me, just the words give up on enlightenment. Give up on even in the act of meditation, give up on trying to achieve any particular state whatsoever, and fully embrace all that you're experiencing, even if that's just a bunch of random thoughts or pain in your body or nothing at all. And it's this way in which, like, I think the story goes that the Buddha, when he finally achieved enlightenment, it was when he gave up. And he was just so exhausted. I think he'd been fasting for 40 days and he just sat down beneath this tree and said, I'm done searching. I'm so tired of trying to achieve anything. And then it hit him. And, it's like we can't go seeking that experience even on, I'm going to give up on enlightenment so that I can get enlightened. I think there's still a flavor of that in me, to be honest, of that there's still some seeking vibe, some energy that wants to achieve something. And that the growth for me in this moment is really releasing that and really like, what does it mean just to be me right now and not at all attached to the idea of achieving some enlightened state or different state?
Yeah, that seeking is an aspect of the mind, right? And there's sort of there's always a longing to return with God is one way to look at it, because we feel separate in incarnation. And the game seems to be, the more you're here now, in the words of Ram Dass, the more you are God, you're with God, it's all one thing. As Maharaj would always put up his finger and say, Sub-ek, all one, all one.
Sub-ek, cool.
Sub-ek, yeah. So he just kept saying, I was just trying to remind us, it's like there only is one thing. And so our machinations in our mind to see it otherwise only creates pain. This is something I felt in the ketamine journey I had.
How so?
Well, every time I would focus, and I felt this in ayahuasca 10 years ago when I had my first ayahuasca experience, exactly the same lesson, just a total different level of intensity. When I'd focus on my breath, which meant I was dropping everything else, whatever thought I was having, whatever desire, anything, I just go back, boom, in, out, and become hyper-present, is when all the bliss and the lessons would unfold, and the deeper and deeper I would go, the more I'd float, and the more it was like these huge feeling lessons. And then anytime I had thoughts about anything, which inevitably are going to be out the past or the future, or a question about this, it's when things started to feel a little going off the rails, or nausea even would come up in my body. And then I would just, instead of thinking about my way out of whatever I was thinking about, just like meditation, let it go and come back to the breath. I would watch as within a few seconds, if not a minute, I would flow into a new blissful state of learning and centered enlightenment. And when I say enlightenment, I mean it's something that you are always in because you're it. And sometimes you pop your head out of it. So it's really like you're falling back into what you are. You don't learn it. You're not given it. It already exists. And I saw as the ketamine was wearing off, sort of going down through the densities back to this viewpoint on reality. Let's just call it three-dimensional reality. And I could watch as I was starting to come back and quite in a present way, see it coming back into form. And a few times in the experience, it almost like quickly like zoomed back into like here, where all of a sudden I'd be in this space where I was looking at like, I remember one time it looked like infinite stars and there was like this horizon and I was floating in it and I was just like, oh my God, this is amazing. I was getting this lesson about sort of that oneness. And then all of a sudden it zoomed quickly back to the blindfold on my eyes, and I could see the material of the blindfold. And that's all that was in front of me. It was just like this banal blindfold. And I was like, oh, well, that's not too pleasant. But as like, I see that I was seeing this stark difference.
Yeah.
And instead of like, oh, I want to go back, or I want this, or I want that, it's like, okay, I let it go and go back to the breath. And it's like, I don't know if we're done or whatever. And inevitably it went into this whole other space.
Yeah.
And the music was guiding that too, which was so cool. And I just want to say to listeners that we were using a record that's coming out in early winter. That's going to be, it's called Spores, and it's excerpts from the Music from Mushrooms album. So it's like an hour-long record that is just like shorter versions of some of the songs from Music from Mushrooms. And it worked fantastically well.
Yeah, somehow perfectly timed for a ketamine session. I was like...
Weirdly perfectly timed, yeah.
Or maybe not, but so much of what you're saying I can relate to. And it's interesting hearing you talk about, all one, and then this experience of duality in a way of like being in the cosmic center and then coming back and seeing the blindfold. And what I find is there's often a moment in session when clients are coming back, at least, the first few sessions, or initially there's a lot of grief and sadness and longing, and like, oh, don't make me come back here.
Like the heaviness,
like,
right.
Yeah, like I want to stay in that space forever.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that that's where a lot of the real work actually is in welcoming yourself back from wherever you were, and realizing on some level, deeper than thought, that none of it is ever separate, that the eye shades and the infinite stars are ultimately one and the same. But that there is a real experience here of duality, that we are living in a dimension where most of the time we feel separate, in our bodies, we feel separate emotionally and mentally and disconnected. And so it's like almost holding the duality of non-duality, if that makes any sense, and being with both. I know some of the imagery that you were talking about after the session was this like black and white, almost like yin and yang type circle.
Yeah. Half black, half white, as a summation of like what's going on here. Mm-hmm. And not even what's going on, but like our perception of it.
Right.
It's that we use terms like good and evil to try to just sum up what is a numinous feeling that can't be put into words, that you feel in these spaces. And then like when we get back down to 3D reality, sometimes we do things like, well, there's good and there's evil, and it's sort of like the engine of life. But, we can make it too anthropomorphic and sort of say like, well, there's a devil and there's God. It's just a way of sort of describing the grist for the mill. Mm-hmm. The fact that we're meant to be in this yin-yang wheel in our incarnation, and that is the point. And escaping it is sort of like impossible.
Yeah.
Like that's the playing field you're on. It's not that will go away. I think like how Ram Dass speaks, it's about witnessing it. He doesn't stop that process. He doesn't destroy his ego. He's just stepped back from it more of the time,
right? With
love, loving the process.
Who you really are, and that part of what I'm hearing in your description, or my own interpretation of it, is that there's sort of this movement in the direction of relaxation, which is what you were describing, around letting go of thought, letting go of anything but breath, even letting go of breath eventually, and just existing. And to me, that seems like the way to navigate the ketamine space, just as an aside, that this process of letting go is the one that really takes you where the truth is, whatever that truth is. And then there's this, in life, there's this movement in the direction of tension. And that the more I've just been deeply attuned to this whole idea, somatic practices and meditations, and feeling my body, and that continually daily blown away and shocked by how, the more I become aware of my body, how much tension I accumulate, just through thinking, really, just through the constant machinations of the mind, and ruminations and projections and fears and worries and insecurities, and even just daydreaming. But that real simply, if I'm in my mind, I'm not in my body. and my body goes into a state of freeze and then starts to accumulate experience. And so one of the sort of like overarching lessons I've been taking from my own ketamine work and meditation work is that the more I can relax, the more I start to actually arrive where I am. And maybe it's that simple, is just relax.
Well, you seem like a pretty relaxed dude in your demeanor. I mean, what practices are you bringing that help you to do that, to relax, to let go?
Yeah, I mean, lately I've been tapping into, I don't know if you're familiar with Dharma Ocean and Reggie Ray, and it's a really strange time to be tuning into those practices because I'm deeply loving them and finding a lot of truth in them and honestly relief and just like, oh, so thankful that I found something practical. And at the same time, you know, there's been an accuse of abuse of power and an accusation, of abuse of power against Reggie and against this part of how he's holding the community. And so there's this kind of going back to your good and evil. It's like, okay, we look at like Chogyam Trungpa or all these spiritual leaders who seem to have some deep wisdom and then showed up in the world in a way that just was harmful and negative. And so my own ability to hold the practices as they are and release them from this person of being good or evil or bad. So that's a long preface to say that the practices themselves are really breath and body based, you know. So in Reggie's work, there's like a 10 points practice where I just lay down for half an hour every morning and I start at my toes and I feel my toes deeply and try to relax them and work my way slowly all the way up to my head through, 10 different points in my body. There's, I think we did a brief version of that in your experience. And then there's different breath techniques. There's yin breathing, just breathing deep into your own belly for a long period of time and focusing on that with your awareness. There's threefold breath. There's earth and I'm at least on board with this idea. I can't say I've like experientially deeply accessed it, that you can, with enough trained awareness, drop your awareness into the earth and feel yourself as connected to the earth and not separate. And that's an incredible relief and sense of support. So, it's
the forms of breathing and meditation.
What's that?
Kind of different forms of breathing and meditation, would you say?
Yeah,
kind of
meditation that's just highly focused on the direct non-conceptual experience in the body and not at all really worried about the mental space, that the thoughts are coming and going and they're not a problem, but I'm trying to relate to my body in a way without any judgments or preconceptions about good or bad or stories or anything like that.
Do you find that that's maybe the biggest impediment that people come in when they're coming in for therapy is an inability to access their body mind, meaning the wisdom of their body or connection to it?
Largely, yeah. I mean, the way I frame my work is that I'm a trauma therapist and that the fundamental function of trauma is to create a disconnect between the mind and the body. And it's a safety mechanism, right? Like if you're being eaten alive by a lion, you don't want to feel that. So you're going to check out and leave your body. And if you've had a lifetime of experience of not feeling safe in your body, why would you want to be in your body? And as a symptom of our culture and technology and our fast-paced lives, that I found coming back from that retreat of just 5 days of just laying on the ground, feeling my body, immediately when I started to re-engage with my phone and with technology and communication and just all this stimulus, I was starting to accumulate tension in my body right away. And that, that would start to feel like depression or anxiety or things like that. And I would have to go back into my body and release it and get a clear mind state again. But that, whether you're traumatized or whether you're just a human being living in this kind of hectic, crazy, fast-paced world, it's really easy and quite a slippery slope to become disembodied. And so, yes, it's a long way of saying the majority of my work is just helping people to feel what they're feeling in the moment they're feeling it. And that's it.
But when people, let's say they come in to have therapeutic work and it's, they're depressed because like something major happened, like their partner died. Okay, something like, big. So they're meant to be quite sad and really going through it.
Right.
And they've really stumbled, or they've really tripped up to now where they're maybe feeling suicidal ideation. They're just in the bottom of it.
Yeah.
And they're coming to you because they're like, I don't know how to go on.
Yeah.
Do you find that there's a danger in something like ketamine where they might walk out of that office that day and yes, they might be like, wow, this is the best I've felt since this began. But where might that be short-circuiting the healing that needs to occur? Because that depression, in a sense, is triggered from something real that needs to have time, needs to have process, needs to have grief. But it's a fine line because you don't want to snowball into a place where you can't even live.
Yeah, and it's a really good question because I think, what you're referring to is bypassing, right? That the idea that we can use anything, but especially substances to avoid and escape and numb from our experience of grief and sadness and contextually appropriate feelings. If you've been through something that devastating, feeling sad is not a problem. It's appropriate. And so what I've found is there is it's really in the relationship, right? So like if whether you're using pot or ketamine or caffeine or whatever substance you're ingesting, most of us are taking something of some kind, even food. That if we move towards that experience with the intention of shutting down and escaping and avoiding, well, we're going to create a lot of that blocked experience that's going to manifest as tension and then anxiety and depression. Or if we hold it in such a way where we use this space intentionally to move towards the experience and go deeper into it, using the added sense of safety that we get from an expanded state of consciousness to actually fully embody and contact the emotion in a really courageous way. And what I find, like you had the variety of ketamine session you got was very peaceful and relaxed and blissful. And sometimes it's not that, sometimes people really do go directly towards the emotion and there's a full expression of it that maybe they couldn't access in their waking state of mind because they have, built up mind, body, ego defenses that say, don't go there. It's not safe. It's not appropriate. It's not okay. That once that part of the mind shuts off, that then the emotion really comes and really what we're after is completion, that feelings just want to be completed. And so all we have to do is make space for them to be lived and felt and completed. And that's where, just like anything, how you use it kind of dictates whether it serves you or not.
Do you think that ketamine is particularly suited for trauma or PTSD in the ways that they've been doing some research about MDMA with MAPS?
Yes, and I kind of am more and more of the opinion that MDMA specifically for PTSD is kind of just the way to go. I think ketamine has some utility there, but it's almost the difference between the way I've been thinking about it is MDMA is like zooming in and so getting really deeply embodied access to your experience, the memory of the experience. Whereas ketamine is like zooming out. And so you get space from the experience, which can be healing.
Sorry to interrupt, but with MDMA, isn't it like that's really only going to be the case if someone's guiding you into that experience and things just are less charged emotionally because of the MDMA? Whereas I felt with the ketamine, like there was something going on, or it seems to be chemically, at least with depression, like the experience itself is healing, where I would say with MDMA, it might not be healing unless there's someone there to guide you through what you need to do. Like on its own, it feels nice, but I don't know if that I don't think it would do much for PTSD, I'm thinking, unless it had that guidance.
100%. Yeah. I mean, and that's why the model they have is mdma-assisted therapy, that it's really
right.
The MDMA is not doing the work. You and the therapist team are doing the work. So and that's where I am curious about. I think you're right. You're onto something, that the ketamine is a little bit more autonomous. But I will say, when I do my own sessions, there's something different about having someone in the room. And
Sure.
I think we even talked about this last time, of just that, the sort of, I don't want to say mandate, the opportunity to be in relationship and to trust and surrender and open and be vulnerable
and be witnessed.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like playing music for one person versus no one is totally different, obviously. But even just one person is almost harder than 1,000.
Yeah,
it's more vulnerable. There's more of a direct relationship.
Yeah, I mean, as you're speaking, that I'm actually, speaking of somatic hits, getting quite a lot of sensation and even emotion in my body, thinking about the simple and sometimes terrifying edge of being witnessed in our messiness and our rawness. It's a theme I've been really embracing lately in my life. And it's one of those things where it's like, oh, this is what I want. I want realness. I want authenticity. I want connection. I want vulnerability. And then getting it, I'm like, oh shit, this is, this feels like dissolution. This feels like complete annihilation, because if I'm really choosing to fully not hide any part of my experience and allow all the parts of me that I hold judgment against, or that I think are messy or too much or not okay, out in front of another person, so much trust and such an opportunity to heal. And that's, the blessing I've been receiving in relationship lately, is that I keep being met with like all these, acceptance and love. And it keeps taking me further into this edge of annihilation that feels big and exciting and just totally crazy at the same time.
It's crazy that we all, as humans, experience the same thing, but we pretend like it's just us. That be like, most people, if they're old enough, have probably had a time when they basically had like a mental breakdown of emotion, or got so angry they threw something, or are sobbing. There's probably been a moment of deep despair where you just feel like a child, just wet with tears and snot, or sexual, heights and lows. Most of us share these things, but we hide the fact that we all know what that's like, as if like you're different. And maybe no one's really, that's so embarrassing. It's like, well, yeah, it's embarrassing because it's vulnerable, but we've all probably been there.
Oh, yeah.
There's all these different colors of experience.
And what a gift we can give one another when we allow the other person to just be exactly as they are. And certainly that's something I'm cultivating more in my life. And like I said, it's a challenge, but it's one that right now is kind of hinging around freedom from expectation. So releasing attachment to outcome. And what does it mean for two people to just moment by moment choose that connection, and choose to stay connected through all of the vulnerability and the messiness, and keep letting deeper and deeper parts of my own experience out in that container. It's
hard not to be attached,
right?
It's hard not to. It's human nature to want security, or expectations are a form of safety. And that's what the deepening of a long-term relationship gives you, is a sense of like, well, I know what to expect. This person is proven. I've seen the different sides of them. The more time that goes on, and after a while, you're like, okay, there's a through line here, and that's what I can. Time has given me that, whether I look at it as an expectation or not. But it's natural for the body or the mind to try to protect you. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's maybe something you could short circuit and say like, well, I'm going to let that go and just come back to presence. And you may be hurt. I mean, inevitably we all do get hurt in different ways at different times. I suppose it's just how much you're willing to be vulnerable. How much strength and security do you feel in your sense of self that you can bring that kind of dropping of expectations and assumptions. It takes a real sense of strong character and will and safety in yourself.
Yeah, and it's, these terms that can sound so cliche or whatever, but that in this work, we were talking a little bit, bringing it back to the ketamine around symbols and archetypes, and that what you're describing, that courage, that bravery, calling on these archetypes that have existed in human consciousness for so long of the warrior, that love or healing or spirit, that this is all the path of the warrior. And that's something that it's so fun in working with my clients and in my own life to see someone connect with that. And on that primal level where maybe they have this 9-to-5 job and their life is feeling a bit just predictable and routine. And then to suddenly invite them to step into becoming a warrior in a way that, they're courageously wielding their own love and vulnerability and bringing that out into the world in the service of their partner or their job or whoever. So there's a lot of fun I've been having of just embodying archetypes and calling on archetypes and letting that be a space for the unconscious mind to play.
There's a lot of different flavors for us to work with, sort of whatever works. But bringing in any sense of courage or the idea of the warrior energy in a lot of ways is done through letting go, right? It does take a form of bravery to not try to control something.
Absolutely.
Or to let it just unfold. And that's what I'm seeing inside that psychedelic experience. And the ketamine, it was certainly easier to do because I didn't have a lot of anxiety in that space. Certainly at times, some.
Mm-hmm.
I was bringing up memories of old trips where things maybe did go really sideways.
Yeah.
And you're sort of thinking, is it going to go there? And then I would just have to let go of that thought. And there's a trust in just I'm not even going to try, because that's where the trauma lies. And it's me being okay, now I'm going to try and control it so it doesn't.
Well, and what you're describing, I think, is Radha had brought this up in our discussion after the session, that the warrior training or discipline there really is this combination of focused attention and relaxation and letting go. That we can't be all letting go and just get lost in the space and let our experience take us, nor can we be all focused, but that when you have, as you probably have, in order to have navigated that space as you did, when you've consciously cultivated a practice of focusing your attention in an open and relaxed way, that you can actually drop deeper and deeper and deeper through a psychedelic experience or just in a daily life experience. And that, I think, is kind of one of the fundamental skills that's required to navigate this space, is actually a daily practice of focusing your attention in that open and relaxed way.
Yeah, it is a form of concentration. I mean, there is definitely an effort of kind of keeping the keel in a certain direction, and that would be that muscle of concentration. And I think the point of all of this is how it's showing you in an amplified way what we experience all the time. It's not a separate space. It's just an exaggerated space of 3D consciousness, and that's a really great lesson. I mean, I kind of think that's what it's there to show you. Is sort of it's in hyper color in a sense. It's showing you things that are part of us, part of life.
Yeah, mind amplifier, soul amplifier, however you want to think about it. I keep being struck by the image that you were describing of falling back, kind of like back and down.
Yeah, I mentioned to you that day is I had a sensation in myself. My entire body was sort of tilting back and flipping almost upside down, and it was. I've had that experience while meditating sometimes.
Right,
it's pleasurable.
Yeah.
But it's sort of it's a very slow motion movement.
And I mean, the reason I bring it up is I tend to have that, from what I can tell, that exact experience on ketamine and sometimes in meditation. And I don't have any answers here, but I'm in terms of all the things we've been talking about and what it means to let go and drop in. I'm just kind of curious about, why back and down, and
I don't know.
in a lot of in some traditions, I've heard that, our masculine consciousness lives behind us. And so, how much of our attention is actually through our day in front of us. That's where our eyes are. That's where our breath is. It's where our sensing organs are. But then we're missing 50% of our experience, which is just this void behind us, this space. And that as a way of playing with awareness and attention to start to bring awareness to the space behind us and further back into stillness. I don't even really have anywhere in particular I'm going with this train of thought, but it just struck me that, we both shared that experience of falling back and down. And
yeah, it's weirdly pleasurable. I had a sense of like, well, where would this go? And I was I kept kind of wanting it to go, or by letting go into almost like out of body states, or, how far into the oneness can I go? So I was sort of just allowing it to flow where it wanted to flow. And that's where it was taking me physically, which is cool because it feels like there's less and less of density of your body, and you're sort of getting more into these etheric feelings and realms because your body is just kind of like becoming very light. I don't feel that heaviness.
And it's so much of what seems to arise in the medicine space and ceremony space is metaphor for life. And everything I'm hearing you describe are at least aspirations for me of how to live my life, which is to let go and float downstream and trust the process. And, that the more I actually embrace that way of being, of dropping into the oneness, dropping into the flow, not trying to control my experience of life, but just allow it, the more richness I'm finding, and of, that primal terror of, of not being in control, and accepting that, and still trusting that somehow, whatever form of belief or faith, you ascribe to, that there is, a sense of being taken care of and provided for. And I keep being blown away by that, the more I lean into it. And
that is the fundamental container, I would say. We'll call it love, being held, taken care of. Like it's impossible to escape that. And then inside that is sort of that dualistic mindset,
right?
Good and evil.
And I think it's a bit of a radical act these days to hold that frequency, that intention, because so much of what I feel in the culture is a lot of grasping and clinging and fear, that like there's nothing trustable about what's happening in the world right now, right? That it's doom and gloom and terror, and it's all going to hell. And, that somehow all these 13.8 billion years of evolution are going to end in some cataclysmic collapse in our lifetime because we've screwed everything up so badly. Like that seems to be the vibration I'm getting from the culture at large. And then to practice in my own way of being like, well, what if, not in an ignorant or blind way, like there's a lot of change that's required and action that's required, but what if we collectively held that intention that we, things are unfolding as they need to, and there's an ability to trust even this experience of collapse. It's not easy for sure, and I struggle with it, but I keep wanting to come back to that because it just seems better than the alternative.
Yeah, and there is a truth in it, and that is the danger of spiritualism or the New Age movement. Is that the criticism has always been that it leads to apathy in inaction, and it doesn't absolve us from making choices and activism. Honestly, I find that a lot of people, like the work you're doing and this kind of work we're talking about, is about doing things from the inside and out. And oftentimes when I feel more connected to all that is, when that's obviously going to include other people on the planet, I have more empathy and sympathy, and I want to help other people more, and I feel more strength to do that. It's the feeling of separateness that creates a feeling of needing to protect yourself. This is mine, that's yours, this is where the line is, this is what the law is for. Usually, it is very important for us to still remember that, like, action in the world and activism is valuable and important. Even if there is some kind of grand design, we're still inside, again, that circle that's half black, half white, sort of half full, half empty, the yin, the yang, where we have our choices, and that's half of that's equally important. And then we have this form of destiny, and they are meant to be a paradox. Because it's not there for us. If we knew exactly how this whole equation worked, well, then the jig would be up in a way. there would be no point to be here and have a spiritual life because you'd know the answer.
Right. And that, I'm a huge fan of paradox. It's one of my favorite places to arrive to, because to me, it usually speaks to having hit on a deeper universal truth that if we're actually, if we found something that is a contradiction, where it's like, okay, as you said, like destiny and choice or predestination and free will, are those compatible? And I think so, but it is a paradox. And living in that paradox just seems to be the human burden or the human blessing, that we get the opportunity to feel all of it and to, really take responsibility for our experience. And at the same time, remember that we're connected. And so I loved what you were saying about working from the inside out. That if you really understand that you belong to everything else, the earth, the cosmos, that you're not separate, then in some way you releasing, or me releasing my anxiety, fear, tension, blame, resentment, trauma, whatever, is a contribution to the whole and a worthy one. And that imagine if we all collectively started to do that, how things might begin to shift and how, the organism as a whole would feel the impact of that.
Well, and I hope that these forms of therapy, there's myriad of them, but the ketamine therapy, for instance, that it can come to people who maybe wouldn't be able to do this, inner city, people who don't have the means. I wish we could be a society that prioritized stuff like that. And maybe there's a way it'll happen. It's sort of like activist ketamine therapy in a way.
Yeah. Well, it raises a lot of good questions. And the reality of the field right now is that psychedelic therapy is very expensive.
That is a problem of design. And that is a valid criticism.
Yep.
I'd like to be reaching people who don't have the means too.
And it's, I feel like this is delicate territory because it's not my place to, judge another's experience or say what's right and wrong or what's needed. But I do wonder, like I used to work in, I spent about a decade working in low income schools, just, the hardest hit trauma and poverty and stories that just break your heart every day. And there was sort of a realization I came to that, I'd been given all these tools as a therapist and a counselor. And actually, it would have been unethical for me to start to apply those tools with these kids, because the reality was they needed those defense mechanisms, because they weren't actually safe. So to open their hearts or open them to the depth of their pain or help them start to reprocess the trauma is like, that would cripple them, because what they're doing is actually really smart, which is to dissociate and shut off and check out from their experience. So it's even a privilege, I guess, to be able to do this work, coming from a foundation of safety where I know I have a place to live and food to eat and that I'm physically safe at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, psychedelic exploration, at least these days, definitely seems to be it's a leisure activity, so to speak,
right?
Because you probably aren't even going there if you're just worried about getting food on the table, and your a paycheck making rent each month. I mean, it's sort of something that you would do in free time. Is like these spiritual pursuits. I just didn't want it to become another vestige of the priest class, where it's like the white priest males sort of say, "Well, we'll get the information and distill it down to you."
Right.
We need to say like everyone can have this experience, whatever fits them perfectly.
Yeah.
And I don't have the answer to say like, well, we just give it to this person or that person, but there is a barrier, as you said, with it being it's pricey, yeah, and so we need to figure out some ways around that too.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm also curious about the potential for using psychedelic healing as a modality for social activism. It feels kind of appropriate. One of the teachers along my path was this man, Don Howard, who recently passed, down at Spirit Quest in Peru. And what struck me as incredible about the way he held the medicine and the work, at least as I experienced it, was that, he would guide these journeys where we'd be on San Pedro, which is this huge heart opening medicine. and then moving through the rainforest, on boats and by foot and interacting with these native tribes. And you couldn't help in that state but feel connected to the entire Amazon and want to protect it and help it. It was just the nature of the experience that you felt at one with it, and you felt the suffering of the tribes and the trees and wanted to help. And so part of me wonders if this Renaissance isn't a way of opening people's hearts towards action, and that if we actually, created healing centers and institutes that were oriented towards not just the individual healing, but the collective healing and the sort of boots on the ground, getting back into the community and saying like, all right, you had this huge heart opening and sudden awakening, and you've reached this new level of consciousness. Well, now what do you want to do with it? What is it that you're going to change in your family or in your community, in your life, whether that's literally just tending the garden in your backyard or starting some, nonprofit to help end poverty. But following your own heart and your own passion and all that's a way of saying, just a lot of gratitude for this man who came into my life and showed me that possibility, that his form of activism was really to just focus on the individual heart, and one person at a time, connect people with the planet and the earth and start to orient them towards service. So I'm
probably is not another way, right?
Yeah.
It is always through the heart. It always one heart at a time, one soul at a time, and there isn't another way.
Yeah, I don't think so. And it gives me hope, though. I think if enough critical mass is called to do that work and to live out their unique heart's purpose, then I don't doubt that we can turn this ship around.
Well, let's leave it on that positive note.
Yeah, perfect.
You're still at your same place, right? Is it codywiggs.com or something?
Codywiggs.com, yeah. That's the website. Yeah.
Cool. Well, keep doing what you're doing, man. It's good to catch up, and thank you again for such wonderful guidance when we were in Denver, and I look forward to more.
Same.
Well, thanks, Cody, for coming back. It's always good to get folks back on the podcast, and he's a good dude. It's great to be able to see him. I'm just glad we could deepen our connection and friendship and just the exploration of the mystery. This song that you're hearing in the background is called Accord, and it's from Music for Mushrooms, a soundtrack for the psychedelic practitioner. And this song, for example, there is a shorter edited version that is on this upcoming Spores record that's currently slated for January 31st, 2020. And that will be on vinyl as well. So the vinyl is being produced right now. It's super beautiful. So it's kind of a way to get the Music for Mushrooms on vinyl and just have a shorter version for those who want a 1-hour version versus 5. Hey, if you like this podcast, or if you're listening, it's a free podcast. And one of the ways you can help us with this podcast, not only is to share it with your friends, social media, email it to people, is to give it a review. And you can do that, particularly on iTunes, on Apple Podcasts. You scroll down, hit 5 stars. Even better, give it a written review. I do read those. We have one here from, let's see, Jimbo Jones, the Galactivator. Of course you are, Jimbo Jones. Jimbo Jones says it's fulfilling and relaxing. You've such a chill personality with enough sharpness to keep interest and enough grace and softness to keep it relaxing. I absolutely love listening to this podcast. Well, thanks, man. I'm not always chill, but I certainly cultivate chill. And I like that, sharpness with enough softness, right? That's what we're all going for. Sharp when we need to be sharp, soft when we need to be sharp. But thank you for writing that one. We got another one here from Artemis of the Nexus. These are rad names. I love it. Artemis says, thank you. I recently found your podcast, which led me to your music. I'm a big fan of Ram Dass's lecture. So finding your collaborative album with him was an awesome treat. Love the podcast and looking forward to exploring a lot more of your work. Well, me too, Artemis. There's different things there to explore, whether it's a retreat or a live event or this. Thank you. So all of you who have been rating it and doing these reviews, you can do it more than once, and we are 2 away at this point from 100 ratings. which is an awesome milestone, but it helps me when I'm reaching out to potential guests, them seeing some legitimacy and saying yes. And I have been reaching out to some pretty interesting people, and I've actually been surprised by some of the yeses. So it takes a bit more work. We have to do some pre-interviews and discussions and reading their books, which is awesome. That's why I love doing this, is to deepen my knowledge and deepen my connections to the outer world and to you guys. But there's some cool stuff coming in the pike, and I am working hard in the background, and I'm always open to suggestions too. You can always reach out at info@eastforest.org to say hi or whatever. Or hey, if you're on PayPal, that's the PayPal address. If you just want to slip us a cool million, just make sure you do it with friends and family, because no one wants to pay like a $50,000 fee. That's a pro tip there for you billionaires on PayPal. Okay, you guys keep walking your walk. I will keep walking mine. See you who are at the SAND conference. But don't take any shit, and if you do it with grace, folks. Please, for God's sake, do it with grace.
Say